Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. Fatherhood is one of those masculine identities that many men interact with in their daily lives. While my own decisions in this area are still yet to be made, I can relate to my next guest story around the decision to become a father. Steve Disselhorst identifies as a father, as an author, and as an entrepreneur. What is significant about his fatherhood journey is that he is a gay father who, before adopting his two children, had to come to terms with his own identity and that identity's impact on the family he had long envisioned. In his new memoir, Determined to be Dad, Journey of Faith, Resilience, and Love, he offers his journey as a tribute to his desire for familial connections, overcoming self-imposed handicaps, and facing the harsh realities of two men trying to create a family. Outside of being a father, his other roles include leadership coach and founder and principal of a consulting firm, which specializes in personal and professional leadership development and consulting for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's lots for us to learn from this man's story, and I'm excited to have a gay father's perspective help us evolve our images of fatherhood and masculinity. Welcome to the New Masculine, Steve.
Hello.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I feel, I just felt a wave of emotion as you introduced me. That title, Gay Father, is just something I carry every day with such honor and gratitude. So it's really, it's just really nice to hear someone say that. So thank you.
That's so funny. I'm so glad I included that in there because I thought about while I was sort of dreaming up how to introduce you, I was thinking about, do I just call you a father because that's what you are, or do I use the extra additive descriptor of gay father to describe you? Because for some people, adding that extra description takes away from the fatherhood piece, and yet I love that it's such an important part of your identity.
Yes, I have lots of thoughts on that. So I love that you called it out. Yes.
Great. Is there anything else you think my listeners should know as we get into this conversation?
In addition to what you've described, I'm also a cancer survivor and a man that experienced prostate cancer, which in many ways is closely aligned with masculinity. And so I think that's an important part of my identity now. And then I also do some coaching, helping LGBTQ people think about becoming parents and the self-imposed ideas of what it is to be LGBTQ, and then really kind of taking away a lot of the ideas of what family was. For many queer people, family was a source of pain and suffering, and so kind of trying to take that back into a place of being loving and giving, and so that's another part of the work that I do. I try to help folks think about, do I really want to be a parent, and what does it mean for me as a gay person, as a queer person, to be a parent? So that's something I'm really proud of and excited to be helping folks discern.
I'm so glad there's somebody doing that. I think I could have used that so much as I was coming to terms with my own identity as a gay man. As I started to come to terms with it, I started to leave out that part of my life of like starting a family, having children, and fatherhood at one point in my life was a really important thing that I really wanted, and actually was the biggest struggle for me in coming out was like, I have to dissolve what I saw, the image I saw of my future family. And I, at the time, before things have sort of turned and there's been more acceptance and there's a lot more, our social constructs and stories about gay families have changed a lot in the last decade or two. Yeah. And so previously I had thought, I'm never bringing a child into a gay family. That just sets them up for failure. That's just having so many extra layers of things they have to work through. I'm never going to do that. And I've been able to work through that in my own and with my own coaching practice and my own coaching tools and support from people around me. Yeah. But I wish that I had had somebody like that to walk me through that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's there's an element of the internal challenges that we face as LGBTQ people around our possibilities in the world. And so there's the coaching aspect of that. And then the other part that I help people is just sort of the support through the process of making a decision, but then actually kind of moving into action, which is the part that can get really messy. And while we have images of, gay families out there, we don't necessarily hear the stories around how long it took or how many failed attempts there were in order to create the family. And so that's a really very lonely journey for many people as they go through that process. And so my hope with my working with LGBTQ clients is really to help them through and support them through that journey.
Oh, I'm so grateful that you're doing that work. And I want to know a little bit more about your professional life and what you're doing out there in the world as we get into this. And I'd love for us to start from a place of you as a person, you and your own stories of what are some of the stories that come to mind for you when you think about your relationship to masculinity. What did you learn growing up about masculinity? How have those things evolved and changed? What's your process been like?
Yeah, so great question. So I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up as a Catholic in a pretty faithful and religious family. I have two brothers and a sister. My father at one point was in the priesthood, so very devout Catholic, and religion and family were very much at the center of our lives. I have a very large extended family, so I have about 26 first cousins, and just have family is like the center of how I was brought up. And I think within that, the generation that I was brought up in the 60s and the 70s, the idea of masculinity was very different than it is today. And so those identities were hard for me to overcome. And I think really the idea of masculinity at the time. So my father, for example, was raising 4 children, very typical for that generation. My mom was not working, so he had a huge amount of financial responsibility, was doing the best he could in the world, and really not very connected to us as children when we were young, because he was focused on being the breadwinner and would come home at the end of the day pretty exhausted and just trying to make it. And so I really it's funny, like I feel like I didn't really start to get to know my dad until I was like maybe going into high school, when my siblings had were starting to go off to college, and there was a little bit more time in his life to actually connect with me. And I remember a breakfast he took me out to, and it felt almost like a date, like I was getting to know Dad. And it was like one of the first one-on-one times we had together, because there was 4 of us. We were 4 children within 5 years, right? Like, so we were always together. There was not a lot of one-on-one time. And especially with my dad, there wasn't one-on-one time. My siblings, obviously during that generation, it was a lot of the idea around masculinity was very much around competition, sort of strength, domination, sort of the alpha male persona. And so that was very challenging for me. So at that time, I didn't understand my sexuality, but I did not like sports. I did not like any of sort of the traditional male things to do. And so I was pretty early on felt like an outsider because we lived across from a park where, everyone would come play football and hockey and all kinds of different sports. And I would not want to go because I hated it. And so I would observe from the outside and then I would feel sort of left out. And so that was my experience. And, then I went off to college and, I joined a fraternity. So while it was stifling for me, this idea around this, very typical idea around masculinity. I joined a fraternity. I lived in a house with 100 guys, right? And it was, all of that very much up in my face. And then finally, I think it was my sophomore year of college, I went off to Europe, to Spain for a year to study abroad. And that was really the first time that I saw men that weren't, strong, dominant, alpha males, and it was a different experience, and it was beautiful. I was like, oh wow, the world's not where I've been living. Like there's infinite possibilities.
Yeah, there's an interesting difference between the European model of masculinity and the U.S. version of masculinity.
Yeah,
and I think that oftentimes the European model can float that line around some of the more feminine qualities of care and expression and passion that we as in the U.S. don't get to do. There's more of a connected energy in the European model than there is in our version of masculinity.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was something that I really enjoyed about being there, and I think that was sort of a turning point for me in recognizing, that there were ways to be in relationship that were different than being competitive and sort of antagonistic and, physically aggressive. And that was a welcome change for me. So,
yeah. So tell me more about how your journey through your sexuality and your identity in terms of your sexuality, how that played out in your ideas of masculinity, how you either attempted to fit the mold of a traditional masculinity or whether or not you never fit in and you kind of pushed the edges the whole time. Like, what was your journey like with that?
Yeah, so I think, it's just a really good question. So for me, I am not overly effeminate, and so I was able to mask my sexual identity, and I was able to fit in. And so I actually, during, high school and elementary school and college, I wasn't aware of my identity yet, but I also was not, overtly effeminate, and people did not call me out. And so while I felt like an outsider, it was my own feelings. It wasn't as if others saw me that way. In fact, when I was in high school, I was incredibly popular, was involved in, student council and all kinds of different activities. I had a wonderful experience, but I felt different, right? I felt like I didn't fit in. But I was able to more or less cover that. And I think that to me has been sort of one of the beauties about like sort of coming out and then coming into my own identity is that that covering or masking is really a lot of self-hurt, right? Like we make decisions to step away from our truth in order to make other people feel comfortable. And so I did that for a long time. And then I came out in the early 90s and then in San Francisco and, lived in San Francisco. So very, very much part of the gay culture. And then, really started working in corporate America, and I felt, and I worked for a large pharmaceutical company, very conservative Midwestern company, and I could feel a disconnect with other men. They were culturally, the company was, while there were many women that worked there, most of the men that worked there that were sort of higher up in the organization, their wives were stay-at-home wives. They were not at all engaged in being parents. So I worked for a gentleman who had 4 children, and he had said to me at one point, "I've never been to a doctor's appointment with my kids." And I was like, how was that possible? Like, kids get sick and they go to the doctor, but he never had gone. So it's like, this was this classic sort of 50s, so I stepped into this company, and I often felt, well, the top line was, we're open, we don't discriminate. I often felt completely like an outsider. We would go to I was in the sales and marketing organization. I would go to meetings, and I would feel like I would have to put on a show. And I would have to act differently, because most of the men that I would encounter in that culture wanted to talk about sports, or, sort of another common discussion for men is sexual escapades with women and conquering women. And, those were things that neither one of those things interested me at all. And so I found myself with a lack of being able to connect with these men. And it, in all honesty, I think it hurt my career, because I was unwilling to engage in fake conversations around things. And I was unwilling to be, completely open and honest. So, even though I was out and, was honest about who I was, but I had struggled to connect with other men in that organization. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally understand that. In some ways, we've come a long way in terms of acceptance in our culture, and yet it's acceptance as long as we don't have to actually address what's the gay male sex thing. It's one thing for men to talk about sex with women and their conquests, but a second you bring in man on man sexuality, it becomes the biggest taboo that we can talk about. And so there is this place where we separate ourselves from male conversations. Partly, I think that's a good thing, because I'm not sure we should be speaking about people from a place of conquest and a place of sexual object.
Yes.
So there's divine sides to that. Yep. But there's also this place of, even if I wanted to participate in that conversation, it's not safe for me to do so.
Yeah. Yeah, I would totally agree with you. I would say that the younger, newer generation, the millennial generation, I think is, much more comfortable with that. If you open the discussion around sex, they're not expecting it. Millennial men specifically are not expecting it to be specifically, heterosexual sexual conquest. So I think there's definitely more openness. That gives me hope. That gives me a great deal of hope. I would say the other thing, though, just to be in all transparency, this idea of objectifying women for heterosexual men, it happens in the gay community as well, and it's a tremendous sort of I think issue as well. So it's sort of like the male dominant culture, whether you're straight or you're gay, you still in many ways the behaviors and actions are it's systemic, right? It's that I'd say is hopefully something the gay community is looking at and looking to change.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're not separate from the culture at large as gay men. And so we are patterning our behavior after what we see. I mean, most of kids as they develop, they're patterning off of what they see in behaviors. Yes. And so when you start patterning off of broken systems that include objectification, then you're going to have it even in marginalized communities. I think in some ways, compound what's been modeled to us with our trauma and the fact that most of us have experienced some level of bullying and powerlessness. We end up doing that to each other. We start taking that out on each other and asserting that same hierarchical objectification with each other that happens with straight men. There is this thing that's taught within masculinity, it seems like, that is, there needs to be a hierarchy of value and worth. And I can assert that either through sexuality, through earning power, through the career I have, the intelligence I have. There's some way that I need to assert my dominance in some way. And we are not immune from that as gay men, that is for sure.
That's absolutely for sure.
So 2 things that I heard you talking about in there that I wanted to pull out is I really appreciate you talking about how you were able to hide your identity and sort of blend in and not be otherized by the external world. It was mostly an internal feeling. I appreciate you talking about that because you highlighted it as both like a great survival tactic for you at that time. It allowed you to move through the world a little more freely. But you also brought up the trauma part of it, the painful part of it that asks you to divorce yourself of who you really are in order to fit in and belong. And I think that is so not just something we as gay men have to face. That is something that men have to face. We are taught from such an early age to let go of pieces of ourselves because we won't be perceived as men.
Yes.
Or masculine.
Yeah. So I'm having a very powerful reaction to that. It's making me tear up. It is, it's a form of self-hurt, which impacts, self-esteem and it's, it's painful, right? Like it's painful. So yes, there is a benefit to being able to fit in, but there's also every time you have that choice, do I be honest in this situation and actually express who I am, or do I keep it to myself so I can fit in and not be called out or for people to look at me differently? I think that's one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about being a coach right now and a leadership coach is the number of clients that I work with that they are every day making decisions to put masks on in order to fit into a culture because they're afraid of being different. And for some of those people, they are already very different because they're people of color or they're women. And so they have this outward identity that they're already trying to downplay. And then they have, their internal voice which they're trying to downplay. So that's a lot of energy. I talk about this with clients often. It's a lot of energy in holding ourselves into sort of the box. I would say the other side of this is that, and I'm seeing it. So I have 2 children. My daughter's 8.5, almost 9, and my son is 5. And I saw it pretty quickly with my son. He was in a at-home daycare in near our house. It was a Cantonese daycare. It was a woman that I had met years ago she had a home daycare. I just kind of fell in love with her. And we put our son in daycare there, and it was a family and the grandparents were there. It was really a beautiful daycare. And then when he sort of aged out of that, he went to sort of more of a structured school. And it was really within 3 to 4 months that I could see him sort of pulling away from me physically, just being around other boys and seeing sort of like them engage in physical activity, very much like, very physical, very, gun pointing and sort of aggressive. And, and I could see him, he would always ask me to carry him into school. And I would, it was such a joy to do that every day, to bring him to school and to carry him. And then in the beginning, he was, as we had always been, he would always kiss me goodbye, and there was always hugs. And it was really amazing, like 3 months into this more formalized preschool he was in, that he stopped wanting me to, he let me carry him sort of to the door, and then he would want to get down very quickly, and then he didn't want hugs anymore. And I was like, what's going on here? I was like, no, it's okay. But it was really interesting to see because he wasn't getting those messages at home. Like we're, very intimate and physical, very close, and he wasn't getting those messages at home, but he was learning it somewhere. that it was no longer okay for him to be sort of like physical. And so I sort of, in some ways, the pandemic's been really great because he's 5 now, 5.5 actually now. And, it's been great because he's been able to be home and be with us and sort of not have to fit into that structure and to that boy sort of competitive energy. And so I'm in some ways very happy about that.
That's so heartbreaking. Then you were noticing, even in a preschool level, like how early that those messages of how boys are not allowed to be affectionate with each other and are not allowed to share caring physical touch with each other. That's so heartbreaking to see how early that happens for little boys.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the research, they show it around 4 or 5 years old. That's when they start to boys start to sort of be socialized that way. And so I think, it's very sad, right? Like,
I had a previous guest on here who's done a lot of research around men and masculinity and was talking about how even you can start to measure at even really young ages, just the way that little boys stop expressing visually, emotionally. They become more stoic in their faces much sooner than little girls do. And how quickly they're picking up, I'm guessing because they're watching the humans in their lives and they see the men hold more stoic faces and not express emotion in the same way. And then they start modeling. It's so wild how quickly that happens and how early that happens.
They are so much smarter than we
They totally are. Well, it points to the other thing that I wanted to point out from the stories you were sharing earlier is that as you're talking about your story with your little boy, it's so clear that your model of fatherhood is different from the one that was given to you by your father. There is this different element in how present you are, how available you are emotionally in the day-to-day care of, that's different than what you saw as a child. And it's different than what you were describing in your place of work, where you were saying some coworkers had never been to a doctor's appointment of their child. Where did you develop that different model for fatherhood, since considering that it wasn't given to you?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few factors here. So one of the factors is I'm an older father, and so that sort of competitiveness and like getting ahead and earning, and all of that was done in my earlier years, in my 20s and 30s, and so the sort of that energy of like, wanting to sort of compete and to gain stability, those were things that happened earlier in my life. I would say the other thing about one of the greatest things about being a gay or LGBTQ parent is the fact that it does not happen through intercourse. So it does not happen after you've been out having drinks and, you're drunk and you go home and you make love. It does not happen like that. You are, whether you go through surrogacy or you go through adoption, it is a process of identifying what are your values, identifying what's important to you, identifying how you want to parent. So you are in a process of discernment in order to actually become a parent that, and I do believe a lot of, heterosexuals do go through this now as well, because I know I've sat in a men's group with a lot of, straight identifying men, and they want to be equal caregivers to their children. So I think that they are going through this, but it's a different thing. We as LGBTQ people work very hard to create our families, and we don't take it for granted, because if you decide to go through surrogacy, you've invested a huge amount of money. If you decide to go through adoption, you've invested a lot of time, in many cases, a lot of emotional capacity, because you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And so those things are very important in helping shape you. And every day I tell my children that the number one thing I do every day is take care of them. Hands down. Clients are very important to me. My income is very important to me. But number one thing I do every day is take care of them. And I'm not sure if I hadn't gone through what I went through in order to become a dad that I would appreciate my role as a parent as much as I do.
Ugh, I wish we could have more men speaking in that way, where they acknowledge that their main role is to care for those around them, whether it's a child of theirs or whether that's just other people around them in their community and their families. Like, that's so foreign to hear a man say that that's his number one job in this culture.
Yes, for me, it's absolutely, absolutely.
Well, something I know you and I can connect over is at least one of your children was adopted through the foster care system, correctly?
Yes.
As an ex-CPS worker, as I was in charge of investigating abuse and neglect with kids in the dependency system, and I can't tell you that there was one LGBTQ family that I investigated because of what you're talking about, because of the hurdles that we as queer people have to jump through in order to become parents. It filters out a lot of the bad stuff to get there. And I'm not saying that this is a heterosexual problem, abuse and neglect, but it is this place where a level of intentionality changes the way we show up in our relationships to our kids. And I'm just so grateful to hear your version of that. And I'd love to hear more about what your journey has been like to become a father. What are some of the highlights? I know I want to encourage people to read your book, Determined to be Dad. And I'd love to give them a little bit of a taste of what it is they're buying into.
Yeah. And before I go into that, I just want to say that I make mistakes every day as a dad, as a gay dad. So we are not above the fray as far as parenting, because what you described before about, how we were brought up, that has not gone from me. Like, I grew up with two brothers that were older than me. I have dealt with, a lot of competitiveness. And so I make mistakes every day in my parenting, probably the same as other folks in their parenting. And so I know that parenting is my thing that is the most important to me. It's like I still make a lot of mistakes in it. I'm challenged every day to grow and to change and to be a better person.
Oh, I appreciate you adding that piece of it too, because that's such an important value of mine in these conversations on the New Masculine is that the expectation is not perfection, is not to create this high bar where then nobody measures up to it, and then we entrench another level of shame into us as people. And so I appreciate the realness of that there are strengths to the intentionality that helped you become a father, and you're a real human that's lived in this culture that is undoing generations of stuff around what it is to be a man or to be a father.
Yes. Yeah. So, your other question around like sort of highlights of the journey to become a dad, I think that as I referenced earlier, so our first child we adopted through the private adoption, and that process was, well, there was a complete psychological evaluation, and we attended a 2-day seminar, and we had to do a lot of paperwork. That process was challenging. It made you think a lot about, how you wanted to be a parent, and it made you think a lot about, was this the right thing for you? The foster to adopt process was much more rigorous. And so the state is very concerned, as they should be, after children have been removed from homes and finding safe families. And so that process was pretty intense. We had a social worker in our house 6 times interviewing us. I mean, in the cabinets, in, the garage, out in the backyard, making sure that the home was safe. And so that was a pretty intense process. But I would say that the highlights of the learning is, as men, what do we like to do? We like to control. We like to achieve our goals. We like to perform. And adoption, there is no control. You have to really relinquish control completely. That's sort of my, sort of biggest learning is this idea is, we were both in professional lives where we worked very hard, right? Like, set a goal, you achieve it, right? That's really important. But in this, there's no linear goal with adoption. You sign up, you do all the paperwork, and then it's like, Russian or roulette, not Russian roulette, but it's like roulette. Like, you have no idea when it's going to happen. You have no idea where your child is going to come from. It's very much a process. So for our first child, our daughter, who's going to be 9 in April, we waited 2 years for her. And during those 2 years of waiting, we had 14 different contacts by 14 different women that were pregnant and considering adoption. And the range of those women were 17 years old to a 49-year-old grandmother who was having a child. And the range in pregnancy was 6 weeks to full term. So we'd get calls. We had one woman who was like, had missed her period, and she was like, called and was like, I'm thinking about adoption, right? And like, so we started to have these conversations very early. She was thinking about it. And then we had calls that, baby is due in 3 weeks and thinking about adoption. And there was one of the major learnings is there's a lot of ideas in our culture around the people that place their children for adoption are young, they're uneducated, they're addicts. Those are all myths. Most of the people that we came in contact were none of those things. And so there was just, this wide range. And obviously, if you can imagine, 14 different people calling you saying, we'd like to place our child with you, and then having them stop that communication. Very, very emotional road. Very emotional road.
Yeah, I was going to say that must feel like quite an emotional roller coaster to have your hopes up, then down, and all around. Yeah. Tell me more about what that emotional experience was like.
I mean, I think in the beginning we were mostly, in the beginning, actually, the first month we got a call and someone was due pretty soon, and we were both like, are we really ready? Like, is it time? And so we were kind of glad that she changed her mind with us. But then, after a year went on, it was, we had a number of calls. We actually had a really upsetting experience with a woman who was not pregnant, who played us. She was what they call a scam. And she, and they are apparently, these people do this with missing persons as well as with adoptions, where they call you and they pretend you're pregnant. And this woman led us on like a 3-day journey through. She wanted to place her child with us, and it turns out it was a complete fraud. That was,
oh wow.
Yeah, I mean, she sent us ultrasound photos. She sent us, she was all in. She manipulated us for a couple of days, and then was like, finally, she was like, I want you to, adopt my child. And we were like, okay, well, we get to talk to the agency. And it happened all over a weekend. She planned it very strategically when the agency was closed, reached out to us directly. And then Monday morning when we were able to get to the agency, she texted us all of this crazy stuff around we were sodomites and we were going to hell, and it was really awful.
I'm so sorry you had that experience. That is, not only is it a letdown, but then also there's this attack on you as a human being. Yeah. That now you're the bad person. Oh, that's so heartbreaking.
Yeah. We were sort of at the end of our road. We basically, the story, I get into it a little bit in the book, but we basically were at the end of our road. We said, maybe we need to do surrogacy if this is not going to happen through adoption. We talked to 2 friends of ours that are doctors. One of them does OBGYN. So we talked to them, and we were really considering surrogacy. And then we were really down. And then Easter weekend in 2012, the day after Easter in 2012, we got a phone call that there was a family in LA. They were really interested in us, and we ended up talking to them. And then 8 days later, our daughter was born. So, I mean, it happened very quickly. And it was, that week was like crazy because we were initially told that baby was coming in a month. But baby came earlier. And so it happened very quickly. And it was all meant to be like, this was our birth family. I mean, they say that, the child that's meant to be with you will be with you. And she's absolutely meant to be with us. And she's amazing. So we got through that, and that was good. And then we settled into trying to be, great parents. And, I think as gay men, we often, because we're not women, we feel inadequate in our parenting. And so, we spent a lot of time trying to be really good at it, and we were very good at it. And then we kind of started to think about, like, do we want to have a second child? And it was really, it was hard because after the first year, like the first year is like pretty much a blur with a kid. And then after the first year, you start to have some normalcy to your life. And it was like, oh, do we really want to go back to diapers and waking up in the middle of the night and all that? And we just didn't feel like the family was quite full. And then we decided we would be willing to go and do a foster to adopt, which is riskier. It's a much riskier adoption. And so we made that decision, and then we started down that journey.
Wow. And then when was your brush with prostate cancer? Was that in the middle of all of this?
No. So great question. And I swear that the adoption journeys, especially our son's journey, was very challenging. We finalized his adoption in September of 2017, and I was diagnosed with prostate cancer about 6 months later. So, in my mind, in my heart, I feel like there was an element of stress that really was part of the reason that I ended up getting cancer.
It's so wild to me to think about the sort of rapid succession of all the ways you're challenged around your manhood, your masculinity. You've got all of these. I had not thought about it in the adoption process. It hits on a lot of the points of masculinity around control, around performance, around achievement. I hadn't really thought about that. So you're being challenged in those areas. Then you have a kid and you're assessing whether or not you're doing it okay based on the fact that you're not a mother to these children. And then you go through an experience of a health crisis with your prostate that challenges the fabric of masculinity also too. It's a lot of really powerful moments all stacked up within a couple of years.
And you asked me to be on here before you knew all that. I think I was meant to be on the show.
I think so.
It was a lot. It was a lot. So.
Have you taken time to actually sit with the fact that all of that came through in your life in a couple of years and actually spend time integrating it?
I mean, I think the reason I wrote the book was really we started our journey to adoption in September of 2009, and our daughter was placed with us in April of 2012, so it was like 2.5 years. And then our son came to us in 2016. So it was really, and his adoption finalized in September of 2007. So we really had been on a 7 to 8 year family creation. It was very stressful. It was part of the reason why I wrote the book was I didn't know it at the time. The reason I wrote the book was really to help other people, that gay people as well as heterosexual people that have struggled with fertility issues around really how to create a family through non-traditional ways. It was really, I wrote it because I wanted to help others. But after, and while I was writing it, I didn't realize it while I was writing, but after, when it was editing process, I realized that it was a way for me to let it go. It was a way for me to sort of detox the experience in my the stress, the lack of control. I mean, we in our lives are, that's how we have jobs, we, have income, we have, we can do the things we want to do. And it was, it was really, it was really stressful. So I would say that for men, so men who end up getting prostate cancer, I think they experience, so for your listeners who potentially don't know what prostate cancer is, prostate cancer has if it's not treated early and if it's not treated in the right way, can make you impotent, right? And the idea of being impotent for most men is very hard to believe and to imagine. And I think with that, men are already isolated and sharing intimate details of their lives. And then they get prostate cancer and they are, like, who do I talk to about this? Right? Like, there's all this shame, right? Like, and for me, my process was really, I went through a very difficult time because I have I have a strong sexual identity, and was very concerned about going through treatment and, the outcomes of treatment. So it was challenging. But I actually think it actually brought me, I started going to a prostate cancer support group. And what I experienced with it is the support group was very medically focused. It was very focused around talking about treatments, diagnosis, side effects. But the elephant in the room around like masculinity and emotions around like how do we physically connect with people if we end up, unable to, sexually perform. Those things were not covered in the group. We didn't talk about it. I experienced this where one day I was driving to the group and I wanted to talk about those things and it didn't feel acceptable. And I actually got to the group. I was like very anxious about going in and I just decided not to go. I was like, I'm not going in. And it's actually when I ended up going to this everyman group where men are talking about their emotions. That was a very powerful experience for me.
I want to hear a little bit more about the men's groups that you're a part of. But I want to highlight this piece that I hadn't really thought about. I can really understand how much of our masculinity is associated with the ability to have an erection and to perform sexually. And when that is potentially taken away from you, I could understand the shame piece and the working through that. I hadn't really thought about the isolation piece that's there too, where most men are pretty separate from physical contact with other human beings outside of maybe a female partner, and most of the time in a sexual nature. It's not just tender, caring, cuddle puddle, affection kind of stuff. And so we've already got men that are pretty isolated, and then you add that element to that. I can't imagine how isolating that must feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's very isolating, and I'd say the contrast is, and this is where men and women are in many ways very different, and where our new masculinity needs to move towards is women get breast cancer, women get cervical cancer. They rely on other women, and they come in connection, and there's really strong community right around that, and yet men end up with this cancer, and they end up sort of in many cases very isolated, and so it's a double whammy. And then I think there's this part of it for your partner that you're trying to like put the best foot forward, and because it's scary for them as well, right? Like, how is our lives going to change if you're no longer able to be sexual? What does that mean? Does that mean we change how we relate to each other in our relationship? And so it brings up a whole huge topics around like relationship and all.
And I'm sure I would assume a lot of people aren't actually having those conversations. They're just dealing with the stress and the shame and the disconnection.
Yeah.
So not even having those in their relationship conversations.
Yeah. So what's been really interesting is, so I joined I was going to a physical prostate cancer support group, and then I found through the local hospital where I was treated that they have like a mentor program where men act as mentors to others. But what's been fascinating is I joined some Facebook prostate cancer support groups. What's fascinating is the number of women that are on the groups talking about how hard it is for their spouse to even talk about it, like even to acknowledge it, and that their husbands have gone into these deep depressions because they're afraid that they can't perform. So it's very, it's really, really, really intense.
That points to something that has been a part of conversations on this podcast around how often it is the women in our lives that are doing our emotional labor for us. We don't have the skills and the tools to navigate these things, so we isolated them and we become reclusive and we become depressed, but in a not the same way that we see depression advertised out there and depression ads, and so it goes undiagnosed and it goes unsupported. And so it doesn't surprise me that there are mostly women going onto these message boards talking about those things, because that's such a common thing that happens in very heterosexual, heteronormative relationships where, and I think even we as gay men can do this. We can rely on the women in our lives to do our emotional labor for us. Yes. And so that's something I really want to empower men to start taking ownership of their own emotional journey and their own emotional experience. And as you said, being in spaces with other men that can support you. We need to create safety around that. And I've been actually seeing a lot on social media about this everyman community that's out there. It's just recently come into my sort of orbit. I'd love to hear more about you going into spaces like that, because I think male intimacy can be such a healing and powerful, transformative experience, not necessarily homosexual, gay sex kind of relating, but just intimacy between men and safety with each other. Yep. So I'd love to hear what you've been through with that.
Yeah, so as I was just saying, I was going to this prostate cancer support group, and it was making me really anxious because I was going there and I was leaving feeling unheard and unseen, and like it wasn't a place to actually talk about the feelings. And so I had a friend who started an everyman group in Oakland and sort of reached out to him and ended up joining the group and started to go every week. And it was amazing for me because I was able to go in, and the way everyman is set up is the way the group works is, you do check-ins, and the check-ins are, they're like 6 to 9 minutes long, depending on the size of the group. And that's pretty much uninterrupted time. People can ask you questions, but there's no solutions. It's like people go and they get really deep on stuff, and they're allowed to just be. And I found with the prostate cancer was super helpful. I just felt a lot of my fears around treatment and a lot of my fears around what it would be like to be, if I wasn't able to, have an erection, and I could explore all that there, and I did. And that was great. And then what I found out later is I stayed in the group for a long time once I had gone through treatment, and actually my treatment went very well. I had incredible care, and I'm healthy. I don't know how to say this explicitly, but I'm able to be sexual. I'm very happy about all that. It all worked out very well. But then I found that I was still in the group, and which was great, and I continued, but I found that I started to have some of the issues that I experienced, the outsiderness of being a gay man in mostly a hetero group. And some of the trauma that I had growing up kind of resurfaced. And there was one meeting that things got pretty tense and heated, and I stayed, and I felt this strong desire to quit the group because I felt unseen. And it was one of the best. I think it's helped me so much because I stayed in the group, and I actually dealt with, some of the archetypes that I had in my past were in the group, and actually and they weren't the people that they they weren't like, they were the really alpha male guys, but they presented as alpha male, but they actually were kind, loving. So I was able to work through some of my like deep fear around being around like alpha straight guys, and was able to work through that in a very positive way.
I'm so glad to hear that there was gold in that experience that came up for you. And because I was wondering as you were sharing, I was like, oh, I bet that trauma came up for a reason, a place to reintegrate and heal some past stories and stuff.
It did. It really, really did. It was an intense like month or two that this stuff came up, but it was very, very healing. And yeah, so I feel like incredibly grateful. I think one of the downsides of the pandemic has been the lack of physical connection. We would meet for 3 hours every week. At, one night a week, we'd meet for 3 hours, and, that's a pretty long period of time, right? 3 hours. And then once the pandemic happened and everything went remote, what happened was, most people were working on their computers all day long, and then they'd get to a 6 o'clock Zoom meeting for 3 hours, and it was just debilitating. And so the group had to sort of adjust. We went to an every other week format for a period of time. We actually played with the amount of time and just did a bunch of other things. But I think there's something about being in the physical space with other men that is, there's just no way to replicate it, because, there's an energy, a safeness energy of being in a space with a bunch of men who you can be completely yourself with, that you cannot get in a Zoom meeting. There's just no way to get it.
There's this theme that keeps coming up as I keep exploring men's work that I'm fascinated about, and I want to have you put on your DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, sort of professional hat on, and see how you'd answer this. I find as I continue exploring men's work and seeing different men's work communities that are out there, there's really well-intentioned and good stuff going on in them. And yet not everybody feels included or feels welcome. And there are barriers to entry for men of color into these groups. There are barriers of entry for queer men to come into these groups, where there's not enough attention necessarily being put on the inclusivity and the safe space of it. It sounds like you went through an experience that really was transformative, but not everybody has the same internal resources to sit through that trauma resurfacing and work through that. How do you see, or what approach would you take when it comes to men's work, if trying to make this a really diverse and inclusive communities that all men or all masculine identifying people feel safe within?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. What we did, and I was pretty vocal early on within our group in San Francisco, very early on. So we have group agreements. It's a pretty lengthy, every man has a group agreement that's pretty lengthy that they share out. So every man's like sort of across the world, and then there's like local groups, and they start with that group agreement. And then that group agreement is something that's read at every meeting. So you have an opportunity to and it's really helpful because, people come in from work and they've got all this stuff going on in their head. And so you sit down and it goes through really, what are your intentions? How are you supposed to show up? It's a little on the long side, but I think it covers everything. For me, I always felt it was like meditation of getting me out of everything that was happening, so we would read that. And one of the things that I noticed in there was that there was a lack of inclusive language. And so I actually put together a whole clause on inclusivity, and that actually and then I brought it forward to the group and said, how do we make this inclusive for men of color and, for trans men and for, queer men. Our group, we had 2 to 3 queer men, so there was inclusion, but it was really around how do we make this reflective of our population, and adding that language and having the conversation with the group made the group actually much more aware of how their own blind spots. Then we did that, and then when George Floyd was murdered this past year, and we ended up having an entire group focused on. So the leader of our group and we sort of worked together on creating, a format to talk about race. And we had men of color in our group to talk about their experience. And it was a really, it was a great teaching moment of how people of color experience the world. And then for, again, well-intentioned men to actually sit and hear and not be in solution mode, and actually sit and hear. And it was really very powerful. And so I think it's about, sort of really being thoughtful and actually putting some time into it and actually looking at the language of these type of agreements when you're putting together to see where are the, the language, where is it missing that doesn't make people feel included? And then also the behavior of the group, right? Who's speaking first, right? How are we making space for people that are not speaking first in our culture? How do we create space in order for it to feel comfortable and equitable for those people to speak up? And so I feel really proud about what we did in that group.
Well, I love the sort of journey from kind of the acceptance model to the more inclusive model, where it moves from just, I'm accepting, to actually intentionally bringing language forward where people can see themselves in it, where queer people can go, this is talking about me. This isn't just talking about other men. This is talking about me too. Or men of color can feel that way too. I love that there was such intentionality around that and that you led the charge on that. I'm totally pitching to you that you should do some of your diversity, equity, inclusion, and coaching work around men's communities around this piece, because if we could do that in communities where men are not performing a role of their job, because there is a lot of DE&I work that's going on in corporate America right now. It's the trendy, cool thing to do in most corporate jobs. And I think if we actually had men in the middle of doing their work, having those conversations, that's where so much more they would bring that and ripple that out into the world and into their work, rather than trying to get them to incorporate it in this one sort of fragmented identity of themselves that's out there in corporate world.
Yep. So that's part of the reason I became a coach I worked at a major biotech company. As in my last year there, I worked as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And I was actually leading up a leadership development program for African American and Latinx employees. And we had a 4-hour authentic leadership seminar workshop. And we asked our sponsor to come to that workshop to kick it off. And he, as in many cases in corporate America, was a white man, cisgender white man, heterosexual, and came and he kicked it off. And he was very in his head. And I remember the lack of connection in the room. And I was sitting there going, we're having an authentic leadership seminar and this person's not being authentic because he's been trained to be in his head, right? So I was he concluded his remarks and I said, hey, do you mind if we ask you some questions? And I just said to him, tell me about a time when you got an assignment and you felt like you were over you were over your head. What did you feel? And he completely shifted. And he was all of a sudden he went into his body and he went into his authenticity. And it was really from there that I was I need to do coaching, because if we're going to really do DEI work, we have to get the people that are leading the orgs to actually look at themselves, because you can't make organizational shifts. It's like a family. It's like being a father. I can't be a good dad unless I'm willing to look at my own shit, right? I can't. If I profess to be a good dad, that we're going to have a great family, but then when I make mistakes, I don't own that stuff. That you can't. It's not going to. So it's the same thing. You have a company and you have people saying, "Oh, we're going to be, inclusive. We're going to do all this. We're going to do all that." But then when they don't look at themselves and their own behaviors, they're not, they're not really able to make that change. So that's really why I went into coaching. And I think, that's one of the, really important things to do. And I think the other thing I would say just is you can find many men in corporate America that are very good people, and then they get in a room with a bunch of other guys, and they get on a stage and they act. And when I say stage, they're at a boardroom table where there's a bunch of other people, and it's all these behaviors come up where they actually aren't able to no, actually, we need to take a stand here. Actually, no, we need to look at how we're hiring people. We keep making excuses why we're hiring people that look like us. No, we actually need to look at the fact that we're not doing the right things, right? And some of it's us are not doing it, right? So I think those are some of the important, lessons.
Yes. This is such juicy stuff for me that I'm so excited to hear. There are people doing this work and that are really actually approaching it from that systemic change, but change from the top, because there's so much of the DE&I work that I've seen that's out there that is put in to give lip service to something, and it is for a certain level down, but there's a certain C-suite level or the higher level people within an organization that it's actually not psychologically safe for them to be vulnerable and to be doing their work in front of their employees. And so there's a disincentive to actually authentically participate in that stuff. And so I just love that you are having such a strong focus on that. And I think one of the ways through that is in our men's communities, in these communities that are starting to pop up and actually support each other, that we can do that work here in their personal lives so that they don't have to do it in front of their employee, or that they just start to actually do their work maybe in private and then be able to start bringing that forward into the work itself. So thank you for that work, and I'm so cheerleading you on as you continue to bring that coaching mindset into it, because I do think that question and reflections and that self-inquiry piece is such an important part that is missing for a lot of people. Well, I've had such a wonderful time talking with you. You have such a wealth of knowledge in just your own personal experience, but also in your professional experience and what you're sort of shifting the way you show up in the world and the way you seek to change the world. So I so appreciate that. If you could come up with one piece of advice to sort of land the plane on our conversation of what one piece of advice or one takeaway you want men to know from our conversation, what would that be?
I would say become conscious of what it means to be a man. And I would say try to shift from the model of strength and dominance and in competition to one of expansion, collaboration, openness, and expression.
Wow. Just a small task for most men. And I love that. And it's sort of really aligned with my belief systems, is that we have to sort of usher in a new version of masculinity that has some safety within its integrated feminine space, that can collaborate, that can connect, that can care, that can be vulnerable, that has emotional literacy of any kind. It's so in alignment with my value system. So thank you for sharing that. If people wanted to find out more about your book, find out more about the work you're doing, how might they do so?
Yeah, so my name is Steve Disselhorst. My last name is spelled Disselhorst, and my website is stevedisselhorst.com, and you can find all my contact information there. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, and so I'm there. You can schedule time with me if you want to talk about coaching, and you can also find my book there. So Determined to be Dad is part of my website, and you can order directly off the website, or obviously Amazon. You can also order at Amazon. So,
or go put your local bookstore in the middle of a global pandemic. Totally. Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll make sure to put all of that in the show notes so people can easily find all of your information, because I think you have a lot to offer, and I'm so grateful that we synchronistically found each other and just started connecting, and that we got to have this conversation. I feel really grateful and lucky. If people want to connect with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram sharing some of my work from the New Masculine as well, a little bit of my personal life on Instagram at Travers03. Or you can support me and this mission of this podcast on Patreon. The website you can go to is patreon.com/thenewmasculine to do so. So grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing a connection with you as we move forward in the world.
Thank you.